We're back. Okay. So what did we decide to talk about?
Well, I think we're going to talk about initially the question of whether or not Thomism is the sole and exclusive position with respect to the theology and metaphysics of God ad intra.
Okay.
Whether or not the Thomistic construal of absolute divine simplicity or divine simplicity
Right.
more broadly.
In short,
understood.
what is your opinion?
In short, my opinion is, although Thomism has achieved a certain kind of predominance, this doesn't represent the full flow of church history in terms of theological history, especially with respect to the rise of high scholasticism and its development up into the present day.
Okay.
In fact, Franciscans, in many ways, to such an extent that in the 17th century, the theologian, what was his name? Caromel.
What's his name? Oh, darn it.
Anyway, he could state that all the Scotus outnumber all of the other schools combined. In terms of especially these questions with respect to Scotistic metaphysics.
Well, were all this diverse opinion or all this diverse school, were they condemned in the 1900s?
Oh, absolutely not.
My question is, were the Franciscans, and also Uniates for that matter, who were doing theology, were they tolerated heretics? Are they still tolerated heretics? Because, I mean, it seems from J. Dyer's position is that Thomism is now reigning supreme as the only exclusive interpretation of dogmatic pronunciations, even going before Thomas.
Yeah. Well, I think in certain ways that did stem from the encyclical Aeterni Patris. And we kind of discussed in an earlier video
does he state in
context.
Does he state in that encyclical that it is the only interpretation of dogma?
Well, no, he doesn't.
Okay. He just puts forth it as a program of study, right?
As a program of study, uniquely suited towards the as a kind of counterblast, a counter ideology, to modern eclecticism, modern philosophy, especially Kant, Descartes, Hegel.
Now, were Franciscan novitiates just told to teach Thomas at that point, or be excluded from the church?
No, they weren't. They did teach Thomas, but they taught Franciscan theology, especially the theology and philosophy of St. Bonaventure.
Which, by J. Dyer's interpretation at this point, and I'm not going to put words into his mouth, means they were being taught heresy beside Thomas.
Or at least a tolerated.
Heresy.
Yeah. But no, that's not the case. In fact, in Aeterni Patris, St. Bonaventure is also recommended by name.
By name.
And also the other approved schools by name.
And do they have the essence-energy distinction? Operationis essentia, pretty much.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is derived from both St. Bonaventure and Scotus. Scotus put it into formal, systematic terminology with his application of the formal distinction.
Right.
And the formal distinction simply affirms that two items, or what he calls formalities, or quiddities, are irreducible to one another, yet they are not. Thus, they're objectively distinct.
Right.
Meaning they're distinct in their intrinsic unity and quiddity prior to any operation of
You're
the mind.
talking about any predications to the essence of God.
Yes, in terms of essence and attributes, operations, powers, perfections. Yes, each perfection, such as God's justice, God's wisdom, God's freedom, they're irreducible to any other perfection. So, for example, God's wisdom is not simply reducible to God's justice. But because God is infinite, intensively and extensively, absolutely perfect, he possesses every predicable that is fitting for him, namely every predicable that doesn't have some inherent limitation through composition, through materiality.
Right.
And thus,
we're not talking about a parenthetical infinity, we're talking about an unlimited infinity.
Yes, in terms of, if you stated positively, it would be, in terms of intensivity or intensive infinity, it would
Analytic
be maximal.
Infinity.
Well, I don't know exactly how to translate it into that terminology.
Okay.
But in terms of an intensive infinity, that just simply affirms that what God is and everything God possesses is maximally perfect, unsurpassably perfect, incomprehensibly perfect, except by a being who is infinite. So God comprehends himself
Right.
and his perfections, but we can't comprehend
Yeah.
these perfections in their proper
right.
mode.
And notice that this terminology here, which is in John, of Damascus, it's in Maximos, and highlight in more distinctions are brought about, only explain these two things. And in simplicity, this will be the framework. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. God is not his creation, and creation is not other than something like God, because it doesn't get its essence from the nothing out of which it comes. Nothing doesn't produce anything, and creatures were produced by the Godhead. God is not like his creatures, and anything that we are is like him. Imago Dei.
Yeah, I think
right?
Saint Bonaventure uses a distinction that God is like his creatures insofar as his eternal ideas
Right.
or energies or operations. They're all operations because
Right.
God is
Right.
fully himself.
Right.
Thus, he is always in perfect act,
Right.
being himself.
Right.
Thus, any likeness God has to creatures is by virtue of the fact that he eternally expresses
Right.
everything that he can know and also everything that he can do. And
They're
insofar
from him.
as they terminate as
Right.
expressions that are knowable,
Because they're from the
they
Logos.
are like creatures.
They're
And
from
God is like creatures insofar as he is eternally expressing
right.
all these through all these energies and in all these energies, anything possible.
Or else you don't have a
and
Logos.
actual. And creatures are like God by virtue of the fact that they always are expressive
Right.
of these eternal energies, ideas,
Right.
logoi. On this point, Maximus and Bonaventure are very close.
Right.
And in fact, when discussing
And I think
divine...
Jay says that, like when it comes to knowability of God. But as far as predication, we know God through his operations, his energies, right? Because I cannot know God as he knows himself, because I'm not the type of being God is. I don't have the same intellect as God. I don't have the same person as God. And like I was saying, the separateness even between us, there's a certain ineffability. We already said that. I know you, Jay, through the created operations of all this infrastructure, and also the personal energies, which would be ineffable in one sense, from Jay, who's producing the video. So I know Jay in his uniqueness, but I only can know you through your operations. So even on the level of just meeting persons, this image here is actually the foundation for this. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And the second one is like it, right? So this idea of how we equate to our neighbor and how we equate to God is because he's an image of God, right? And the distinctions that John of Damascus says about the knowability of God, things we can know, things we can't know, things we can utter, things we can't utter. There are claims I could make about knowing things in Jay or other people, or Jared. I can know about them, but I only know through their operations. Now,
this distinction between essence and operation, right, or forma and energy, essence, energy, form and or essence or nature and form, or form and operation, is rooted in the Council of Chalcedon, and clarified and ratified both in the Lateran Synod of 649. This distinction between essence and operation, essence, energy, form, operation, form, energy, and also
for you who are confused, operation is the translation to energy in the West, and if you have this kind of like force idea of energy, you're wrong. Energos means this working, like an opus, right? Opera, operationis is just the substantivized form of that, right? So energy just means the work of God.
Well, and it ramifies beyond that in both Lateran 649 and Constantinople 3, with the distinction between essence and energy on the one hand, and also between then the essence and its faculties, manifesting the essence through the faculties in their energetic operations. So thus you have energetic operations of intellect, energetic operations of volition.
Right.
And so in order, and this is standard Aristotelian.
Well, that's why
you can't have
and that's just a
essence
reduction
without an energy,
and that's
manifesting that, rendering this substantive, concrete, and real.
Right, and that is just a reduction of saying, you notice this intellective, voluntary, these distinctions. You say, well, that's a West accretion. Well, what do you mean by the wisdom of God? If not understanding, are words becoming meaningless? What about the hand of God in action and will and all these things? I mean, these are just a categorization on our side of something simple in the Godhead. Now, we're not saying, and we're only knowing it through the energies, right? So we're still on the same page. We're still on the same page here.
Yeah, well, even in terms of the concrete reality, that's mine. The form has to manifest and operate through its energies and the powers themselves. So forms or essences have powers.
Right.
Powers have energies. Thereby, essences or forms have energies, manifesting various faculty or power through energetic operations.
Right.
And so there has to be a distinction on the one hand between the substantial form or nature under consideration and the energetic operation and manifestation, and both are required for the common existence of both. So energy is required for the form to be real and active, but form is required as the substrate for the energy to operate and manifest.
Because there's a continuum to the nature.
Yes, and clearly there's a distinction.
There's a simple continuum to God's nature, or else he's not an entity.
Yeah, and so getting back to the formal distinction of Scotus, the formal distinction simply asserts that because of God's infinite perfection, like the Damascene says, like Bonaventure, like Scotus, like all of the great doctors of the church assert, including the Cappadocians, that God is not compounded of things beyond or outside of himself. That's simply what it means.
He's not created.
But that doesn't yet specify the nature or what can be said about the essence positively. Now you have a certain Thomistic construal which looks at divine infinity, divine simplicity as the absence of composition. With nothing really positive asserted. But the Greek tradition, flowing from Gregory of Nazianzus, flowing from St. Maximus the Confessor, and manifest and taken on, especially by the Franciscans in the West from St. John of Damascus, asserts not only that God is simple, meaning lacking parts, uncompounded, but that God is positively infinite, both in terms of his intensity. He's maximally perfect, infinite in himself, but also in terms of the extension of his ideas. He knows all possibles, and these are an actual extensive infinity. And thus only an infinite being could comprehend an extensive infinity of possibles, and also, in a sense, transverse the abyss between infinity and nothingness into creation.
Yeah, and infinity is what we mean by simple.
And so
he's simply God. He's simply God.
Yes.
This when we talk about absolute simplicity, I mean, I think what Jay has constructed is really a caricature of what we mean by simplicity. I think it's more Islamic. But
well, I think in a certain sense, the construal coming from and through Aristotle by St. Thomas lends itself to a reading, perhaps, of seeing no distinction within God, and thus lacking any ability to distinguish between, say, God's essential act of existence and his contingent, free act of creation. And that's just simply because there is no basis for distinction in God. Distinctions are only virtual and recognizable upon the occasion of creation. But in the Damascenian, Bonaventurian, and Scotistic account, which is essentially identical to St. Maximus on this point, there is a positing of an actual infinity of divine ideas that are eternal and eternally expressing all possibilities knowable, but also the items out of which God freely, because of this formal irreducible distinctness, yet in real non-composed identity in the one infinite being of God, between God's intellection and wisdom and his will to create, he's able to select items based upon an order of fittingness, his good pleasure, to create a certain order. But this freedom is formally distinct from his knowledge. And his power of volition is also formally distinct. And all we mean by here is that, again, we say that freedom is essentially spontaneous, self-directive,
it's distinct in the sense
but
of
it's
our
not
experience
separable, and it's not compoundable. The whole Franciscan Damascenian notion of simplicity is simply to avert the notion, and this is getting to what you said earlier, about the fact that God is not creation and creation is not God.
Right.
By saying uncompounded or simple,
right,
all their meaning is that God is not composed from things beyond
Material.
himself, prior to himself.
Yeah.
He is not subject to augmentation or diminution. He is not he's not disposed in any way towards becoming a part of some other third thing. No, God is absolutely in himself. But nevertheless, his absolute in himselfness, which is infinite in mode and thus incomprehensible by a finite mind.
Right.
Nevertheless, within that infinity, there is also manifest through creation certain perfections that are irreducible to other perfections, namely wisdom and will, knowledge and will, even essence in any one of these powers, these perfections, that are irreducible and objective. They're prior to the activity of the mind, even the divine mind.
Right.
Noting their distinction. Neither the divine mind nor the human mind creates or imposes these distinctions in order to help facilitate greater understanding.
Right.
No, these items are distinct prior by virtue of simply what they are. But because of God's infinity, his infinite perfection, and the mutual compossibility of all these perfections in an infinite perfect being.
Well, you're not positing like some other realm of limitations or forms, like a platonic form world or eternal ideas.
Yes, when we say real identity of, say, the essence of God.
You're just saying he has a nature.
And his energies. You're saying, no, all of this is God.
Right.
Ontically and inseparable. The energies cannot exist independently or separate from either one another or from the essence of God. Nevertheless, there is a valid objective distinction that imposes itself on the mind that the mind then recognizes and responds to.
Right.
And thus you can both avert a kind of dualism or a separation which a real distinction between essence and energies taken in a scholastic sense would seem to imply, while still upholding the objective validity of such a distinction between essence and energy. So it's not merely according to bare opinion, as it's not merely created by the mind. No, it's something objective. It is they're discernible according to reason, because they're spiritual realities. They're immaterial aspects of the one infinite God, just like a created person. You distinguish between memory, intellect, and will. You distinguish between the soul and
these are
powers.
not just consequence to an actual act of creation. These are consequent to the just all possible ideas in God.
Of course, they're already in God.
See, this is even
extensively infinite, and
it's not even it's not dependent on the fact that he did create.
No, these distinctions are prior. They're constitutive of the reality that God is. Nevertheless, there is a distinction in God between his essence as intensively infinite in mode and incomprehensible, and the way and the manner in which he expresses these formally distinct energies or ideas or rationes eternally with respect to both his powers, his pure perfections, memory, intellect, and will. He knows the difference because they're different.
And the evidence of that is he's created distinct beings.
Yes, and we don't come to drawing distinctions and say in God between memory, intellect, and will by virtue of the fact that he created. God doesn't arrive at these distinctions in himself, or the distinction between ideas, because he created. He doesn't kind of discover them post factum and thereby only have a potential infinity of ideas based upon what he actually creates. No, he has an actual infinity of ideas because he's the perfect free artisan that has all of these identity, these ideas or energies, simply
because
by
he has
virtue
power
of being infinitely
and
wise.
because he has wisdom and authority. He can limit things.
Of course,
he can create things. He can do anything. So he can put limitations on things other than himself.
Well,
and when it comes to expressing these things in creation, we have created energies. What's that? Well, we have here's an analogy for people who maybe not follow everything. And Jared, you could point the points of difference and the point and the point that is the essence. I have a personality, I have a form, and I have a material reality. You can look at the things in me, the energies in me, which ones are personal, which ones are of the soul. They have dynamisms of their own, right? So when and let's say my body, let's say, just like I say God is separate from his creation, let's make a quasi-similar statement. But let's put it down in analogy where we're only talking about a limited being, but something that's distinct, like the composite of the human person. How do I know? How does my person permeate my body? Right? By authority, by will. Is there personal energies that come? Like if I can move my finger, what? By intention, by will, by intellect. My understanding sometimes doesn't even come into it, right? But if I cut my finger off, those energies are not there. And I can put it in a petri dish and keep it alive, and it has its own dynamisms. And you'll know that these energies are from a separate thing, right? The problem we're talking about is the tactile moment. Is there a touching between God and his creation? Well, no. There's the acting of God within his creation. This is subsequently, this also gives us the whole framework for being in the mystical body of Christ. Right? This goes to sacraments and everything in the church. Right? So just like I have distinct energies in me as well, like from different from the hierarchy of being, different dynamisms happening in me on different levels. I could keep a hand alive in a petri dish, but then I can't move it with my mind. I'm no longer proprietor of it, right? But there's still a continuum. Like, where is my soul? Is my soul in my finger after I cut it off? Even though there might be life, if soul is the principle of life? You see how even when it comes to distinctions in us as far as influence, we have a difficult time even understanding how the spiritual self is in a place. And if we have inadequate distinctions even there, you talk about, well, there's mysteries there. When we talk about the Godhead and his distinctness and how he works, where is the moment of interaction? How does that happen? Right? So think of analogies like that when it comes. It'll help you to understand the Damascene. It'll help you understand the problems that are making these distinctions. And to say, like, we don't come up with a hyper disjunct between God and his creation, because obviously without God, we don't exist. Right? We're not alternates to God. We source everything in God. Who we are, essentially, and what we do actively, where we go in our nature, everything is purposed and created and has been decided that this is what he elected. We're already part of a covenantal election just by being. We're we're a partial of the possible ideas. And therefore, we're not putting distinction in God when we say he has this expression in creation of distinctions, right? And the one to the many is this relation of touching to the creative power of God, right? And we see it go toward a created monad, right? A union by our analysis, because we see it toward one energy. But we're not separating. You have a lot of problems that are being kind of over here, right? When we start analyzing genus, we go to this monad, which is not what we talk about when we talk about God. It shows us the energy, the created or uncreated interaction between the Creator and humanity and his creation, right? And to say that you can't say anything about the essence of God. No, I think we could say analogously and all these kind of things in the divine names of Saint Denis or Saint Dionysius come into play here, right? But we have to also contend that the further idea, there are certain things that are not enunciated in the Damascene and Maximos that are implied there, such as the univocity of the word of being. I exist, created, yes, but I exist. God is in himself. Now, when I use that word, am I using it equivocally? If I'm using it equivocally, what's the alternate? Less of being? Nothing? You see what I'm saying? There are certain things we can approach to saying things about the essence of God, but we're not talking about knowing him as he knows himself. We're talking about there has to be some sort of adequacy between us and God, because for heaven's sake, we exist and don't have to. But the fact that we exist means we are. And if we are like God in some sense, because we exist. And God exists of himself, and we exist contingently. He exists without limit. We definitely have limits. And this is true of the angelic sphere as well. And so he's not just in the heavens, he's creator of heaven and earth, of all seen and unseen. And so this distinction that we just talked about also applies to the angelic world. Right? So these different things, we'll go on, and you're probably going to riff on another point. You got something out there. You got your iPad out.
No, I was just actually, I think we need to, in order to clear the way, we need to demonstrate that Thomism isn't the exclusive or sole
that's
or universal
that's where we first started here.
And I think there are 3 or 4 basic texts, and some of my books just fell on the floor. 3 or 4.
Pick them up, or?
No, that's fine. 3 or 4 basic texts from the Latin magisterial tradition that demonstrate that Thomism, and this is prescinding from the fact of the existence of multiple schools, which we talked about earlier, and continued chairs and papal ratification of the conferral of pontifical degrees ad mentem Scoti, ad mentem Bonaventurae.
Right. And not just as tolerated, but as authentic schools.
Yes, pontifical faculties, pontifical academies, forming, training generations of theologians and priests and friars in the school of St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas, St. Blessed Duns Scotus, in the light or in line with their key theological and philosophical positions.
Right.
And so there are several pontifical documents that support or bolster the claim that the Franciscan school is not merely a tolerated sect, suspicious or savoring of heresy within the broader Catholic tradition, but rather is an approved school, positively mandated and supported, patronized by papal authority. The first document is the definition, or the document declaring St. Bonaventure a primary doctor of the Church. Now, notwithstanding what people might think of primary doctors in the Church and the Latin's unilateral declaration as such, nevertheless, the text of 1587, the declaration Triumphantis Jerusalem, in which Pope Sixtus V declared, declared Bonaventure a primary doctor of the Church precisely for his scholastic theology. He was canonized. His scholastic theology, his speculative theology, his metaphysics were recognized and approved by papal approbation, both in his canonization in the 15th century by Sixtus IV,
what was
and
the
later
name
on
of the document again?
Triumphantis Jerusalem.
Okay.
It was promulgated.
Three fountains from Jerusalem.
The triumphant.
Oh, Triumphant.
Triumphantis.
Okay, Triumphantis Jerusalem.
Is that was published in 1587 by Pope Sixtus V, who happened to be a conventual Franciscan and a Scotist. Who was also the founder.
So a heretic pope.
Well, that's right. You had
according to Dyer.
You had several heretic popes, all the way up to the great pope. What was it? Was it Nicholas? Which pope was it now? Oh, Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits.
Oh,
who was the last conventual pope.
Oh, okay.
But in any case, Triumphantis Jerusalem declares Bonaventure one of the 10 primary...
That's heretic, joking, though. Obviously, we're making a spoof on the fact that Thomism is, it's not the only school. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. There have been as many or more Franciscan popes than Dominican popes.
Right.
Thus, as many or more Scotists than Thomists who ascended to the papal throne.
dunces.
At least in terms of monastic or clerical ordination and association.
So they were calling the continuation of the Eastern tradition in the Church, when they say dunces, they were mocking
Duns Scotus.
They were mocking that tradition.
That came out of the Reformation,
Right.
Dunce meant, the cap of an ass. A dunceman. A stupid ass. But Triumphantis Jerusalem declared Bonaventure a primary doctor of the Church and spoke of St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure, the two greatest scholastics, representative of their followers as two candlesticks shining in the one Church of God, and thus giving ratification of the entire Franciscan tradition through Duns Scotus, and the modifications in favor of and clarification of an assertion of the absolute primacy of Christ and the Immaculate Conception. The fundamental metaphysical substructure of Scotistic metaphysics was in large part already presented by Bonaventure a generation before. Scotus, in a sense, as my great teacher, Father Peter Damian Fellner would often say, crossed the T's and dotted the I's. And really rendered the Franciscan vision of Bonaventure, the translation of the mystical experience of St. Francis, into philosophical and theological idiom.
So they were theologizing off of what we would call divinized humanity.
Certainly. There's a great deal of correlations between the Franciscan
there's certain Orthodox that believe Francis is just subject to prelates.
Oh, sure. Right. There's a new article coming out.
But then Simon Stylite was, because that was crazy too, wasn't it? Kind of idiosyncratic. Huh?
That was very idiosyncratic. I don't know how many Stylites there were.
Right. But no, Orthodoxy is monolithic in its monasticism because it's got Stylites, it's got people that go in caves, it's got all these other different disciplines within monasticism.
It's got
Aromatics, it's got Cenobial, it's got a lot of different. Now they don't call themselves Franciscan in this, but they would call themselves followers of Saint Anthony, Saint Basil, Studites. So it's not monolithic.
Well, interestingly, and this is a bit of a parenthetical, I think within the historical...
It's a little bit more monolithic than orders, though.
Yeah.
It's a lot more unified.
But
just gotta say.
Interestingly, though, it happened about the same period of time, the rise of hesychasm, the clear articulation and speculation on hesychasm.
Oh, yeah.
And the hesychast as true, or the hesychast as a true locus theologicus.
Right.
As motivation for the uncreated light. The experience of the uncreated
kind
light
of like
articulated
what St. Francis was
via the distinction between
Bonaventure.
essence and energy for St. Gregory Palamas. Obviously, St. Gregory Palamas was deeply rooted in the Byzantine theological and philosophical tradition, but nevertheless, the vindication, in a certain sense, of the uncreated light, based upon the essence-energies distinction in God, was the hesychast, their concrete mystical experience.
What actually happened.
There's an interesting parallel in the Franciscans, because Francis had definitely in a Latin cultural idiom, manifesting itself according to Latin psychology, Latin devotions, there was nevertheless a manifestation of Christiformity in the East. I don't know, not that I've heard of.
Okay.
There have been more demonic attacks in the East. That tends to be the manifestation of getting beat up by demons. That seems to be the Eastern manifestation. That's demonic.
Right.
But that's the way their I guess their focus of ascesis and nipsis.
Are there people that say stigmata is demonic in the East?
I'm sure there are,
because it's a fruit of the heresy of the West.
You can find any kind of...
this is not a...
But you will not find that kind of language in the great representatives of Eastern Orthodoxy in the 15th century, in figures like St. Mark of Ephesus or Gennadius Scholarius.
They wouldn't say that.
They wouldn't say that, of course. No, they affirmed and integrated a great deal of Bonaventure and Scotus. This has been amply documented in my own work, in the work of Father Christian Capez.
And you're not reading into it.
No, I'm not reading into it because they cite the texts.
Yeah.
They cite the text.
And there was a communication and everything.
Absolutely.
The fact of even the dispute with Barlaam and Palamas means there was scholastic theology going back and forth.
Absolutely.
See, there was a dialogue, and was there authentic? Who did Barlaam? What school did he represent? Where was he developed? Was he a Franciscan?
Well, I mean, but getting back to the point of St. Francis is St. Francis was taken on, the truly spiritual man, like the hesychast, was taken on as a locus theologicus, and an object
and his
of theological reflection that manifested itself in
Franciscan theology, like Palamite theology, was based on divinized humanity.
Yes,
according to the monks.
An essential formational component and intellectual component of the representative theologies were rooted in the reality of the mystical life, the mystical experience, the perfect man, the man perfected in the greatest conformity to the Spirit, the greatest conformity to Christ.
So
it's interesting. You find these parallels coming up at about the same time.
Right.
in terms of chronological history.
And this is also happening in
the 13th,
Union
14th
churches,
century,
right? There's Stoics in the Union churches as well.
Sure.
Right.
So getting back, so this is an interesting methodological correspondence and overlap, and the Eastern Orthodox theologian who's done work in Bonaventure, but recently has published, and also is an expert on the theology of St. Gregory Palamas, Tikhon Pino.
Okay.
He just graduated from Marquette.
Okay.
He actually just recently published a paper. I'm glad he did it, because I had this idea years ago to pursue the interesting correspondences between theological methodology and sourcing in the Franciscan tradition,
right,
with respect to St. Francis, and in the Pauline tradition with respect to the Hesychasts. He published a paper arguing. It's just it's coming out.
Well, I have he probably mystically stole it from you. Is that what you're claiming?
Our guardian angels were talking.
Guardian angels were talking. Okay.
But I actually congratulated him on pursuing this topic, because it's an important topic.
Yeah, it's a very important topic.
And it shows that methodologically and in terms of presuppositions, while the spirituality and the imagery, the visuals, even though St. Francis, where did he receive his message from Christ? It was from a Syriac icon, interestingly enough.
Right.
So there's also already
the
Eastern
cross of
component.
San Damiano.
That's right. It was Syriac.
Right.
That was an icon. It wasn't a statue.
Right.
That's Eastern.
Right.
But anyway, so there are these interesting parallels.
Cool.
I would encourage people to check this article out once it becomes available. You can look him up on Academia. Tikhon Pino.
Tikhon Pino.
Tikhonpino. And he's written an interesting work comparing St. Bonaventure and St. Maximus the Confessor for Franciscan Studies. It was published maybe 3 years ago. Worth looking
Which are
into.
the kind of studies probably Mark of Ephesus was doing?
Absolutely. Mark of Ephesus was directly involved with this.
So the big guns on the other side were doing what Tikhon is doing right now.
Absolutely. The two greatest, the greatest scholar that the Catholic Church has on these particular questions, especially with respect to Paulinism, Franciscanism, and Thomism, is Father Christian Capes.
Okay.
He does the best work. Also, he does brilliant work on Mark of Ephesus and his role at the Council of Florence.
And he's not a tolerated heretic.
He just did a massive...
Is he a Thomist?
Well, you know what's interesting? He's not a Thomist. He's a Scotist in metaphysical conviction, and he is a patrologist in methodology and sourcing.
Right. And why is he a Scot? And why isn't that just mutually exclusive?
Simply because I think Scotus and Bonaventure represent a more adequate reception of the patristic tradition, especially with questions pertaining to person, the metaphysics of God, the Trinity ad intra,
right,
and the
they
understanding of God's relation to creation and His purpose in creation.
So they didn't appropriate in their situation at the University of Paris. They did not take on some of the new adaptation of Aristotle coming from the it admitted of degrees.
Clearly, the Franciscans took on less,
right?
Because certain fundamental tenets of Aristotle were simply incompatible, especially with their understanding of will,
right,
of the essence of God,
right,
of the structure of the human soul
in the East
and its faculties, and the understanding of the relation between the soul and its powers or faculties. Right. Then you have another reception in St. Thomas, which took on much more, especially in terms of Aristotelian philosophical psychology,
right,
with respect to the understanding of the relationship between intellect and will,
right,
and the relationship between intellect and will and the soul. Right. The Franciscans are completely different on this question. And this ramifies or moves into discussions of the Trinity ad intra,
right,
these same kinds of distinctions, this kind of analysis, as well as discussions of Christology.
Right.
Like what is the constituent aspect, the formal characteristic of the hypostatic union? The Franciscan school and the Thomistic school, especially the Franciscan school represented in Duns Scotus, is worlds apart from the Dominican school following St. Thomas, or the Thomistic school. Then finally you have the extreme Aristotelians who basically follow Arabic commentators, especially Averroes, which are called the Latin Averroists. But there was never a monolithic reception of Aristotle in the West.
Is Thomas at all interpreted with an emphasis on some of that Aristotelian analysis by Averroes still?
Well, there's a great deal of interest in the Arabic sources of Western scholastic philosophy in the Middle Ages. I think pretty much everyone agrees that Thomas was not an Averroist.
No.
But nevertheless, the common understanding of Thomas, and rightly so, is one that is radically faithful to Aristotle in terms of philosophical psychology and certain implications for questions pertaining to divine simplicity. Clearly,
and that's where it
but the
diverges a little
Franciscan
bit from
school
the Franciscan.
is worlds apart in terms of their metaphysical account.
Right.
They start from the same place, and they end up in many ways the same place in terms of confession.
Right.
But they would argue that they get there more consistently, and it's more adequate
Right.
to the entire witness of the patristic tradition. The Easterners took on the metaphysics of the Damascene, and by implication Maximus and Gregory of Nazianzus, and even to some extent Gregory of Nyssa, through their affirmation of the Damascene in terms of the metaphysics of God ad intra, this emphasis on divine infinity rather than just simply simplicity.
Right.
And also their philosophical anthropology.
And
it follows the Damascene.
infinity and simplicity
And
are
of course-
correlative.
Of course they are.
Yeah, they're correlative. They're
Yes,
not this idea of
Yeah, well, in terms of Bonaventure's disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity, it's a document divided up into 7 questions
okay.
pertaining or dealing with, in a kind of pedagogical way, the various energies or perfections we attribute to God as essential.
Right.
So he begins with being. The first question, that's the propedeutic. What's interesting about Bonaventure in this text, and it's an interpretive thing, is that he doesn't separate into 2 treatises, De Deo Uno and De Deo Trino.
Right.
He deals with both at once, tries to.
Right.
And so his method is to alternate between, say, the philosophical notion of God's being and an affirmation right next, Article 1, Article 2, within the same question, the Trinity of God's being. So he moves through 7 questions, seven aspects or categories. He goes from being, unity, simplicity, infinity, eternity, necessity, and then he ends with primacy.
Right.
And primacy, there's only one article, because he's dealing with the twofold primacy with respect to predications about God. The primacy of essence, God is first by essence, but then reduces that, traces that back to the fontal primacy, the innatiability, the unoriginate Father who is the source of the Trinity, the sole source of the Trinity.
Yeah.
And
and it's not equated, the totality of created being, the monad, is not equated with this end of argument as far as the philosophical proof for God as well, right?
No, the Franciscans very clearly see the problems with certain arguments, certain cosmological arguments.
Right.
They say the cosmological argument is ultimately incomplete.
Right.
It's helpful arriving at a certain point, and this everybody calls God. St.
Right.
Thomas's 5 ways.
Right.
Everybody calls God, but they see that if you don't affirm this argument, the cosmological argument, also along with the argument from the image, that radical distinction in creation between personal being and impersonal being on the one hand, and then ultimately an analysis of the ineffability of the name of God as being and as goodness, as one, I am who I am, and Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Because then you don't bridge the gap between the ineffable Creator.
Of course, you don't arrive at a person.
Right, exactly.
This is not the God of Revelation. This is not the God of the Covenant. And Bonaventure, a key point for Bonaventure in this text, and I'll get to the point I was making.
But it is a tracking toward the God of the Covenant.
Oh, absolutely. Bonaventure builds it in because, again, he doesn't separate De Deo Uno from De Deo Trino.
Right.
He says, if you have a perfect being, this perfect being must be triune.
Right.
And he begins this with his question on being, and he ends with his question on primacy. He says, if you have perfect being, this being must be triune. We only know this through revelation clearly.
He's not proving it from a natural triad.
Absolutely not.
No.
He does say, because of the very nature, the triune nature of God, there are objective vestiges.
Right.
According to power, number, and weight.
But they are not arguments toward the Trinity.
They're not demonstrations.
They're not demonstrations.
They're objective, a parte rei. Reality, rooted in the reality itself, manifestations of a Trinitarian God, but it's not recognizable through scientific certitude, a kind of Aristotelian definition, or an Aristotelian conclusion based upon revealed premises, a mixed theological conclusion, including revealed premises and premises from reason. No, Bonaventure says we cannot know the mystery of the Trinity in itself through natural reason alone, but nevertheless the Trinity objectively manifests itself in creation.
And it must, because that is the true God.
That is the true God.
Because we know that by faith.
He can only manifest himself as he is.
But we know that by faith.
But we know that ultimately by faith. We have a certainty by faith through revelation, the revelation of Christ.
The argument from the natural triads does not give a certainty of faith.
No, it provides, assuming assuming the postulates or the discoveries of reason,
Right.
we do terminate in a mystery.
Right.
And we understand that any kind of philosophical conclusion we arrive at isn't sufficient for
Right.
explaining even what we're talking about.
Right.
But nevertheless, it doesn't take us all the way. We need revelation because we don't see God.
And it's from faith that we know
We
that
don't see God directly.
Well,
we only see him through his operations,
Right.
his energies.
Right.
And in Scripture, it's types.
Right.
And not just types. You have typifications in the
Right.
angel of the Lord,
Right.
but retrospectively, from the position of the new covenant in the church, we recognize that these types, these manifestations, are also theophanies.
Right.
Not just of power,
Right.
not just of a generic God, but of,
Energies.
well, energies, but energies through hypostases,
Yeah,
distinct
exactly.
hypostases.
Right.
Clearly a distinction between Yahweh, angel of Yahweh.
Yahweh.
We speak of the Spirit of the Lord,
The
angel
pre-incarnate
of the Yahweh.
Logos.
Yes, of course. The pre-incarnate Logos manifesting himself through signs, the
Right.
burning bush.
Not the Father.
Not the Father. The Father is always manifesting
Not
himself.
the Holy Spirit.
Yes, the Father always manifests himself through
Right. The Son.
the Son.
Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that almost all the patriarchs had an experience of the angel of Yahweh. Almost all of them. Look through the text.
Right.
But let's see. Getting back to then this notion of simplicity
Right.
and infinity, Bonaventure distinguishes or deals with simplicity and infinity side by side. Two questions in a row, and he says simplicity affirms negatively. Like if you're saying what simplicity denies is composition, compoundedness.
Right.
Anything outside of God, beyond God, below God, is not God. God is simple in the sense that he is what he is.
But it doesn't mean he can't have
But it
distinct
also
energies.
posits the containment he uses
Right.
of every nobility or every noble perfection,
Right.
every pure perfection that doesn't imply limitation.
And that's actually
doesn't
Jay's
imply
point.
categorical being.
That's
and
actually
then he goes
Jay's
on
point.
to discuss
He's
infinity,
a Bonaventurian.
the very next question. And he specifies that infinity is not just a negation of an end. It's not just a negation of a completed action. Infinity is the way the mind begins to say that God is maximally perfect.
Right.
By virtue of his simplicity, which implies the actual containment of every perfection fitting to God. And thus, if fitting to God and it's a perfection of God, is necessary
But
for
the
God.
perfection not as understood,
But
created.
the perfections are distinct. They're known distinctly because they are distinct.
Right.
His essential perfections of, say, wisdom,
Love.
will, love, justice.
Right.
These are manifested distinctly because they are in some way a perfection that God knows and possesses as distinct, nevertheless inseparable from who he is in his intensively perfect, infinite essence. So for Bonaventure and the Franciscans, simplicity and infinity are correlatives.
Right.
They're not oppositions, and they're not simply a denial
Right.
of parts
Right.
or composition. No, it's it's a denial of composition and composability or componability.
Right.
It's a denial of this with an affirmation of positive infinite perfection. And Bonaventure
Which we know by the
gets
energies.
this. We know this because they're manifest
Right.
in the energies.
Yeah.
And they terminate in created or in synergistic co-essential causality with
Right.
created energies.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, that's built in again. There's no kind of primotio physica
right.
in the Latin the Franciscan Latin philosophical position. But Bonaventure and Scotus get their notion of divine infinity, the metaphysics of God ad intra in his being, directly from Gregory Nazianzus and St. John of Damascus.
Right.
And Bonaventure even quotes a triple infinity formula. He says God is that infinite being, infinitely infinite. In question 3 on simplicity in the De Mysterio Trinitatis, ad argumentum number 13. And the only other place in the liturgy, the patristic corpus, that this appears is in 2 figures.
The Damascene?
No, doesn't appear in the Damascene. It appears first in Maximus.
Okay, Max.
Maximus, this triple infinity and formula, utterly and completely unique, according to the
continuity with
Thesaurus
Maximus.
Graecus, right?
Right.
The only place it appears elsewhere is in John Scotus Eriugena. And you know what John Scotus Eriugena did?
What?
He translated Maximus in the Cappadocians.
Oh, okay.
And, he got into a bit of trouble for his Parafusion because it sounded, and maybe was, a bit pantheistic. But everybody read him. So he was condemned at a council in, I believe, the early 1200s. But nevertheless, Bonaventure is at the University of Paris in the 1230s and 40s as a student.
Right.
And he read everybody.
Right.
There's no disputing that he was the best educated scholastic theologian of his age.
Right.
He was a genuine master of arts from the University of Paris, and he read all the sources. He knew them better than anyone else. Whereas St. Thomas and Blessed Duns Scotus, they achieved their status as Magister Artium in the Dominican and Franciscan studiums, not at the University of Paris. Bonaventure was a true doctor of the arts, Magister Artium, before he entered the Franciscan order. So he had the best education, and he was reading these figures. And so what I'm saying...
he was a secular...
He was a secular master. He'd already earned his Master of Arts before he entered the order. Even though from young childhood he was committed to entering the order. He earned his Master of Arts before he entered the order.
Right.
So he entered as a magister. And there is nobody that compares in terms of literary finesse, beauty, and learning
as well.
And linguistics.
Because he read the Greeks.
He did read the Greeks. That's fairly certain, because in Book 2, when he's discussing the distinction between thelema and boulema. Thele and boule. It's a distinction he takes out of the Damascene, and he's discussing the Damascene. But he doesn't just use the terms.
And what are those terms?
Oh, goodness, I would have to say. But they pertain to...
It has nothing to do with Aleister Crowley, thelema.
Well, thelema is will, and boule something to do with particular choices or elections.
Just for all those esoterics out there.
But I'd have to go back and research and rehearse.
Do an etymological kind of thing.
But what Bonaventure did that was interesting is very telling, because people have suspected that he knew Greek. Right. Many people thought he did. They didn't know the extent to which he knew Greek. Some people now, modern scholars, say he didn't know Greek. You know, this is just a myth in order to bolster the reputation of Bonaventure. Well, in this question, the section where he's dealing with the Damascene in Book 2 of his sentence commentaries, he's not just dealing with the Greek terms in terms of transliteration.
Right.
No, he's parsing them.
Right.
He is changing the cases to fit the actual syntax of his Latin.
Right.
He knew the Greek well enough to do that.
Right.
With both of those terms. So in a sense, it's fairly clear he did know the Greek. Even though he read the Damascene in translation, he was able to deal with the Greek, and he had some access to at least glossaries, translating the Damascene, certain terms of the Damascene, or dealing with certain terms of the Damascene in their original language.
Right.
And that's an important point to note. But the point is that Bonaventure takes his metaphysics of God ad intra from the Greek. It's a predominantly Greek notion that he's getting this from. It's not Augustinian simplicity or Thomistic Aristotelian simplicity. And Bonaventure is a primary doctor of the church, right?
Right.
Now, move forward. So Bonaventure was a leader of the school. There's a pontifical academy named after, the Seraphicum, the Pontifical Academy of St. Bonaventure. Right. It exists to this day. Right. And what did they do? They teach Bonaventure and mostly Scotus.
Right.
But because the Franciscan school understood there was a hermeneutic of continuity, there was a development, not a falsification or a contradiction between Bonaventure and Scotus on these fundamental metaphysical insights and distinctions and categories, as well as major thematic interests of import.
Right.
Clearly, the strong emphasis in terms of metaphysics on infinite being, infinity metaphysics, the formal distinction.
Right.
All of these things are present in Bonaventure, carried through and achieve a greater perfection and clarity in Scotus.
Right.
And then the emphasis on the place of the Holy Theotokos, Christocentrism, that gets translated into a Christo primacy.
Right.
In Scotus. These are all a continuum.
Yeah.
And so what you find then is the schools continue.
Right.
And the Seraphicum is giving out pontifical degrees, and you've got hundreds of Franciscans for hundreds of years.
Right.
Arguing vigorously in favor of their position within the full embrace and approval of the church.
Following the traditional liturgy, everything like that. This is before Vatican II.
You know what's interesting is in the preparations for the Council of Florence, the Franciscans were given the topic of preparing for this discussion. What was their topic? The essence of God.
Oh, the essence.
They were given the God topic.
They were given the God.
They were given the God
because they had the metaphysics.
Isn't that interesting? And then Mark of Ephesus and Gennadius Scholarius. Gennadius Scholarius comes to.
Well, the Thomas couldn't even start with the question, right?
Well, they weren't adequate to deal with the Greeks on this level of debate because they didn't have facility in the Greek texts in the way that the Franciscans did, nor did they have a kind of integration of this Greek metaphysical system that the Franciscans had. And interestingly enough, and here's something interesting, is that Bonaventure wrote 3 sets of disputed questions.
They also had a lot of interaction with the East because of Jerusalem, right?
Of course, and missionary efforts. Very, very early. And of course, a lot of polemics too. Yeah. Especially with respect to papal primacy. But that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
And it's a real topic.
Right.
But interestingly, Gennadius Scholarius, right, the first patriarch of Constantinople,
the Greek Periti at Florence.
Yes, the collaborator with Mark of Ephesus, the primary representative, one of 2, at the Council of Florence for the Greek contingent, for the Patriarchate of Constantinople, right? Mark of Gennadius Scholarius actually visited the Franciscan Studium Santa Croce in Florence and had access directly to Franciscan texts and actually quotes, or very much appears to quote. And this is something Chris Capes wrote up as an introduction. So he was
using the corpus.
He wasn't just using the corpus. He was using the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum of St. Bonaventure. He was using Scotus. He says the Franciscans are orthodox, or at least closer to orthodox, on the question of God ad intra. But he was also quoting from the De Mysterio Trinitatis. Now, in the Latin West, the De Mysterio Trinitatis went out of circulation for some reason in 1298. Well, not 1298. The last person who cited it was Peter John of Olivi, who died in 1298.
Okay.
But then you have it cropping up now, and this is undiscovered. Just like this implicit quotation by Bonaventure of Maximus the Confessor, this was undiscovered until recently. But the conceptual and literary parallels between the De Mysterio Trinitatis on the disjunctive transcendentals,
right,
infinite finite, necessary contingent, prior posterior, those things, absolutely metaphysical, absolutely central to Franciscan metaphysics, and really not played up too much in Thomistic metaphysics, seemingly falling out of or rooted in the Greek patristic fathers like Saint Maximus, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. They use these distinctions,
right,
and they seem to be rooted in Stoic logic, not Aristotelian logic.
Right.
He's quoting
these distinctions
that are found in the De Mysterio Trinitatis in the order that they appear in the De Mysterio Trinitatis in the 1430s. And we don't hear again of the De Mysterio Trinitatis until it was rediscovered in the 1870s by the great the great compiler and editor of the critical edition, the Kouraki edition of the Opera Omnia of St. Bonaventure.
Oh, wow.
So you have a Greek quoting
this is new to
Bonaventure on metaphysics of God ad intra.
Wow.
And he's the only one doing it for 700 years.
Yeah.
600 years. It's incredible. So no, there's no opposition here, and moreover, there's no monolithic approach to the question of divine simplicity.
And it shows you the
Catholic
sincerity
communion
of the Greek emissaries,
absolutely,
who were really studying the Latins.
Gennadius, he loved Thomas, but he didn't follow Thomas on the essence energies. He used Franciscan sources like Bonaventure, like Scotus, like Franciscus Meirones, a disciple of Scotus in the early 1300s. To articulate and argue the essence energies distinction in his own Paulinite circles. Okay. And interestingly, going back to Chris Capes, he just wrote a 600-page dissertation at the University of Thessaloniki under the directorship of the former Elpidophoros Lambridiosis, or Lambridiosos. He was like third in command in the Patriarch of Constantinople.
So that's who's directing his
thesis. That's who directed his thesis. And the Patriarchate of Constantinople is publishing his thesis as we speak. And he's arguing and he's pointing out these historical, conceptual, theological, and philosophical parallels and dependencies on the part of Gennadius Scholarius as a great polemos, as the disciple and collaborator of St. Mark of Ephesus, using Franciscan metaphysics to argue against the Thomists. Their conception of the essence energies distinction over against this notion of the absolute divine simplicity.
He enters the Franciscan Thomist debate.
Absolutely, because Gennadius
on the essence of God
was actually a great lover of St. Thomas in most ways, but not on this point. Not on the question of the metaphysics of God ad intra, or on the question of
so the same points for which J. Dyer says Thomas is inadequate.
The Franciscans say Thomas was inadequate. So does Gennadius.
Exactly. So the
Gennadius, who is a great fan
Yeah.
of St. Thomas. in
So
every other
people
way.
who knew the corpuses, like who read every book, and even
That's
the
right.
Eastern emissaries at the time when this stuff was not just on YouTube, this stuff was real. This was journeys across the Mediterranean.
So we got to move
all this
ahead,
kind of
though.
stuff.
I mean, we've got the continued reality of the Franciscan school, never broken, except for a short period of time when all of the
Right.
theological faculties were busted up through the French and Italian revolutions.
Right.
But immediately reconstituted. Then you have Aeterni Patris, and we've already said that Aeterni Patris. now, Pecci, the Pecci brothers, one of whom became Pope Leo XIII.
Right.
They were formed, and they became formators in seminaries. And as bishops and archbishops, they saw the lack philosophically of any kind of integral system. Moreover, they saw the threats of modernity, especially modern philosophy, Kantian, Cartesian philosophy especially, but also Hegelian.
Right.
And they said, we need something to
Like ready-made.
be a counter blow. We need something that people can wield.
Right.
So this is the context out of which Aeterni Patris was composed. Because in fact, if you look at, say, now this is problematic. You look at the definition of the Immaculate Conception in 1854,
Right.
and the definition of papal infallibility, especially the issue not so much of papal infallibility in specific, but papal primacy. Those were two heavily Scotistic Bonaventurian doctrines, both of those.
Right.
Pius IX, the immediately preceding Pope. So it wasn't Thomistic hegemony.
Right.
And then looking in terms of Aeterni Patris, well, he needed, really, this is the term, and I documented in my book, he needed a counter-ideology. I think he even used that term.
Right.
But within the same text, he affirmed and ratified, he didn't contradict or revoke Triumphantis Jerusalem.
Right.
There are still two primary doctors, and he quotes Triumphantis Jerusalem in Aeterni Patris,
Right.
recommending St. Bonaventure. Moreover, Franciscans had scruples, and there's a great book by Willibrord Lampin called Duns Scotus et Sancta Sedes, and it gives every single papal document affirming the place of the Franciscan school in the Catholic Church as a legitimate, justified, bona fides school of theology, not to be condemned. So, a couple of things then. Aeterni Patris quotes Triumphantis Jerusalem. Well, immediately after Aeterni Patris, the Minister General
Right.
of the Brown Franciscans, the OFMs, wrote to Leo.
Right.
And said, so what does this mean? We can't study Bonaventure and Scotus anymore? Because this is what was this was the word on the street, right?
Yikes.
And this document is provided in the Coracchi edition of the Opera Omnia of St. Bonaventure. He said, no, I never meant that. I never meant that. You're perfectly free to study St. Bonaventure and Blessed Duns Scotus. There were at least 5 inquiries over the course of those early years, maybe 30 to 50 years, where Franciscans inquired, always affirmed the right.
Right.
And validity of the Franciscan school. Bonaventure, Scotus. Now you get to Pius X. Pius X was ready to canonize, beatify Scotus, moving towards his canonization. Then the crap hit the fan.
Right.
The Dominicans...
The wind got smelly.
Yes, Dominican or Thomistic theologians came up with 100 heresies of Scotus, presented this document, killed the beatification. The problem here was, and here's the problem, is that there was no critical edition at that point. So we didn't know how to distinguish authentic Scotus from spurious Scotus.
Right.
But already a previous pope had said, and this is back in the 14th, 15th century, any authentic text of Scotus is not to be condemned.
Right.
The problem was finding the authentic text. Now, some of these messages didn't get to the Thomists. They didn't read all these things.
Right.
But nevertheless, they stand. The record stands. And the work of producing a critical edition was almost immediately taken up.
Okay.
Initially under the great American-Canadian theologian Ephraim Longpré,
Right.
OFM, and then taken over by Karl Balich. And now the Opera Theologica is complete.
Right.
The Ordinatio and the Lectura.
Right.
All of the writings of Scotus. We have a critical edition. Now, some people aren't happy about that. We also have a critical edition of the philosophical opera
Right.
of Scotus. So we have a critical edition.
Right.
But no proposition of Scotus has ever been condemned formally. There's not
Right.
one proposition. In fact, several propositions have been affirmed
Right.
about the nature of confession.
Right.
Some theologians thought that you had to have oracular material
Right.
in terms for a confession to be valid. Well, the Eastern churches never believed this.
Right.
And Scotus didn't either. And the Eastern churches agreed with Scotus on this. And in fact, maybe even you, Scotus.
Right.
There's an article in Novus Vetura from 2017 that makes this point.
Well, I mean, even general confession is a practice. Is a practice that is general absolution.
Dire straits.
Dire straits.
Yeah, you can give a conditional absolution.
Not just the biker band.
That's a Scotistic position. It's an Eastern position.
Right.
The question of the Immaculate Conception, that's fairly obvious. Now, some people want to argue, like Garrigou-Lagrange and his latter-day followers, that Thomas ended up affirming the Immaculate Conception. You know what? I don't even care.
Right.
Because no Thomist did. In fact, they came to blows over the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
And the Franciscans won on that question.
Right.
So there's been no...
that's just the affirmation of Panagia.
The purified.
Purified.
Of Gregory Nazianzus and St. John of Damascus.
Right.
Absolutely. That's right.
Right.
There's
but
a
in
book
terms
on,
of...
There's a book on that, too.
In terms of kind of the discussion on original sin.
That's right.
And how does that differ a little bit really quickly? Between
with
East
respect
and West?
to... Well, okay. I mean, the
because that's going to be brought up immediately in the minds of people.
Okay, Saint Augustine had a notion of original sin that had to do with physical generation. Right. It was tied to a notion of traducianism. Thus, it located original sin in terms of transmission as not just the occasion, but the locus or source. And that was condemned.
So
procreation, and thus there was a kind of stain,
right,
that arose through the process of procreation itself. The original sin was located in the substance of the composite itself,
right,
the term of the substance, because of concupiscent,
right.
Relations. But this position was condemned quite quickly, and by the time you get to Thomas is thoroughly Augustinian on many points, but Thomas, following Anselm, as well
beautiful
as
euphemisms,
Bonaventure and Scotus, said, no, Augustine's wrong.
Right.
The Western position is that Augustine's not right on this point.
Right.
And there's no problem. Sin is located in a lack of order.
Right.
A lack of order that should be there.
Right.
Because God decreed it.
Right.
And he gave Adam the means to preserve it, but not the means to regain it if he rejected it.
Right.
It's located in the will.
Right.
Sin is located in the will, and the occasion is concupiscent.
Right.
Procreation.
Right. Because we passed that on.
We passed that on, and it's a lack of justice that God, or righteousness or orderliness of soul that God decreed that should be.
And that's
case.
St. Paul.
That's St. Paul.
Because of one man.
Yeah. And so any sense of guilt that comes through the Augustinian tradition has been severely mitigated and is understood strictly as metaphorical.
Right.
You don't have personal. Don't blame me for Adam.
Yeah, I said that, didn't I?
Yeah, that's right. There's no. It's the notion of guilt. Original guilt is metaphorical.
Right.
Yeah, there is something true, and there's a true liability or a disposition to sin and punishment.
Right.
But you have no personal sin. You're born with the effects of being not in a state as God decreed He wanted you to be.
Like the Orthodox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you suffer the effects.
Yeah, and
it's called sin and death.
Right.
Yeah, we sin personally. We ratify this disposition personally, and we die because of it.
Right.
We're not born in a state.
That's why Christos Voskres is so triumphant.
That's right.
Perfect humanity.
There's no problem with original sin. I think that's.
So when we say Immaculate Conception, we're not in any way talking about the macula of Saint Augustine.
No.
Thank you.
We're worlds away from that. He does use the metaphor of a stain on the soul. But Immaculate Conception just simply states that Mary had no part in Adam's moral headship. Right. Uniquely. She's Panagia.
Right. Well, there are many Orthodox...
She's perfectly deified.
Well, I mean, there is the idea of without stainness is in the Greek words, right?
Well, and you can find overlaps. There are scholarly articles published noting St. Gregory of Palamas's dependency on Augustine on the doctrine of original sin.
Right.
Augustine.
The real point here is probably the fact that the papal monarch pronounced it.
Very likely, yeah. That's the problem.
Come on, let's be honest. Maybe.
Well, I
think we agree that the Theotokos is
Panagia.
pure, is Panagia, right? Right?
Yeah, we do. We agree about that.
then,
Anybody who says she's not is a heretic.
Right. And that.
What does Panhagia mean? What's more glorious than the cherubim? What's beyond compare more honorable than the cherubim? Beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim?
Now,
what does that mean?
If the Patriarch of Constantinople says she's Panhagia, we as Westerners should be like, right? No. We affirm it with you, and you'll be like, well, there's a lot more complicated than that. Yeah,
sure, it's fine.
Yeah, okay, fine. But we're just telling you where Catholics now. If you want to go and create a straw man that you can destroy, that's fine. If you want to go and also the people that go to Orthodoxy from Protestantism, if you want to go and take your scripture sources and say, hey, look at this, all have sinned, and that's from Protestantism. It's not from patristics. Okay, so don't infiltrate your Orthodox apologetics with Protestant apologetics against Catholicism. Right? Make sure that when you're arguing against Panhagia, as proclaimed by a patriarch, whether he is infallible or not, let's say it's just true.
Well,
it's true whether he's infallible or not.
She's
Panhagia.
A computer programmer who's actually a very good theologian. He was Orthodox,
right?
But from last I've heard, he's actually become Ukrainian Catholic. He's a very intelligent guy. He used to write on Ancient Faith Radio for their blogs.
I feel sorry for him. Now he's red-headed stepchild.
Yeah, but he has a couple of papers on the question of the Council of Carthage and the question of original sin. And he shows essentially that with respect to Pelagianism and original sin, the East and the West agree. Yeah, and he does a very good job. His name is Nathaniel McCollum. He has some very good papers. You can look him up on academia. His papers are well worth reading, and he's a good scholar. Getting back now to the narrative. So what you find then with Pius X, you have a kind of setback in the cause of Scotus, and combined with the need for a counter ideology to modernity,
right,
and the recommendation of Thomas and oblique.
You got a real ambush going on here.
Yeah, you got ulterior references to Bonaventure,
right,
but it never rescinded. In fact, quoted Triumphantis Jerusalem, that positive statement of two candelabra standing in the midst of the church.
Right.
Bonaventure, Thomas.
So you don't have magisterial opposition; you have cultural opposition.
You have cultural opposition, and it becomes functional.
Right.
Through canon law.
Right.
And the so-called 24 Thomistic Theses.
Right.
1917. Both of those were promulgated. And many Thomists and many non-Catholics who only understand the neo-Thomist,
right,
the traditionalist narrative with respect to the exclusivity,
right,
of St. Thomas,
right,
they read these as binding and exclusive, delimiting, excluding any other school. But what's very interesting, and this is something important to read, is yes, canon law does recommend the study of Thomas in
right,
in seminaries.
Right.
It recommends Thomas as the common doctor. What do you mean by common? Yeah, you affirm St. Thomas insofar as he affirms common metaphysical and theological truths.
Right.
There's nothing specific about Thomas. In fact, many ideas of Thomas have been condemned.
Right.
Like oracular confession to a layman in a state of emergency. That's
right,
not a position that Catholics can hold. There are many ideas. You don't want to dig on Thomas, but again, Thomas is not perfect. But so
by the way, I didn't know that the oracular confession thing. I learn everything. This is the doctor. This is the doctor right here.
People will cite the 24 Thomistic Theses that came from the pontificate of Pius X, St. Pius X, into the pontificate of Pope Benedict XIV. But they forget to read the prefatory letter. And it's interesting to note that the composition of the Code of Canon Law, the 1917 Code, and the promulgation in 1914 of the 24 Thomistic Theses, these were going on at the same time. So there was discussion. So under Pius X, the 24 Theses, under Pius X, also the codification. Again, first time in history, codification of canon law.
Right.
Both of these things. So they have to be read against each other. But here's the prefatory letter.
Where are you taking this from? The Pius X Decree on the Sacred Congregation of Studies, Thomism, prefatory letter.
Let's see here, 24 Theses. And this is very important because it does put forth the 24 Theses. And again, these are kind of canonical, practical procedures to continue that anti-modernist, anti-secularist counter blow towards eclecticism and modern philosophy.
And this is not just your interpretation so that you have wiggle room as a Franciscan theologian.
No.
Okay. How so?
Let's see here. Clearly, they affirm that the 24 Theses are representative of the authentic thought of St. Thomas.
Okay.
But there's now dispute over that.
But this is about the thought of St. Thomas, not about Catholic dogma.
And they're philosophical theses, too.
Philosophical.
But nevertheless, it... okay. With no less... let me see if we can get this right. I don't have the full letter here.
We can bring it up in a different video.
It's important because it's a key point. Because the explanatory letter to the 24 Theses said, yes, these are to be affirmed. Right. These are safe. These are safe.
Right.
But they're not exclusive. And they include the language of other approved and venerable schools.
Right.
And no Catholic is to be held to any of these particular theses beyond what the faith holds and beyond what is strictly necessary. So, because they had inquiries from both the Jesuits and the Franciscans about the nature and bindingness.
So the whole prefatory letter is not in the Denzinger.
I thought it was, but okay. No, this is not satisfactory. You go ahead and talk.
Okay. Well, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I'm learning a lot here. But the whole point of this is to show that the characterization in some of the articles of J. Dyer and some of his recent things on Thomism and all that kind of stuff, and probably maybe part of his series on papal stuff, is going to draw from the fact that Thomism is the exclusive apparatus for interpreting such dogmas as divine simplicity and other things like that. And what Jared is showing you is that it is not. Now, I mean, as a cradle Catholic, I was just struck by no, that's not what we believe. And I've read, and my educational background, I mean, I'm shoeing horses and stuff right now, 8 years military, but before that, I almost completed a master's in philosophy in the phenomenological school. So, I mean, I'm
okay, right here.
Okay, we got
from
it.
Studiorum Ducem. This is again Pius XI's now. This is the problem. I got the dates.
So it's a different.
It's
a
the
different
dates, commenting, clarifying the nature of the 24 Thomistic theses.
So how can we find this?
It's in Denzinger.
Do
right
the
here,
reference.
1923. I'll find the exact Denzinger reference. Maybe I will.
So it's at least authority against authority. Kind of nullifies the strength of J. Dyer's claim.
It's not even in Denzinger, which is wow. Anyway, Studiorum. Right here. Studiorum Ducem, number 3667 in Denzinger. But let not some exact more from others than what the Church, the teacher and mother of all, demands of all. For in those matters about which there tend to be opposing,
listen to this,
opinions argued among authors of higher distinction in our Catholic schools. All these are technical terms, by the way. The Franciscan school is one of those schools of higher distinction. No one is to be prevented from following the opinion that seems to him the more probable. And so
we're not bound to a Thomistic metaphysics or even the caricature that absolute, ADS. This is the hammer.
And
this is the hammer. This is you can't be Catholic.
And you also read a document from 1951 published in Franciscan Studies on the status of Thomism in the schools by
this is the doctrine
the
of the
Jesuit
church.
scholar.
No, if this is the reason, Jay, you're not a Catholic, this is not a good reason.
Yeah, Pelster in 1951 published a 25 takedown of this kind of Thomistic exclusivism with respect to Catholic philosophy and theology. So then, okay, we've got this. So the 24 Thomistic theses, they become normative, but nevertheless never exclusive. And I read the very words, let no one exact more than what the church, the mother and teacher of all, requires of all.
And normative
and
means to be safe. Regularly talking.
Safe. It's safe. It's not required. It's not even a positive ratification.
But do you think that those things actually teach the type of divine simplicity that Jay is talking about? Even those Thomistic points?
I think.
You think he's got a point?
I think he does have a point.
So you do have a point, Jay.
I think he does have a point. Thomistic metaphysics, especially with the question of absolute divine simplicity, does limp in terms of explanatory power.
And Jay, you might be helping the Catholic Church by doing this.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, because you're taking down some of the interpretation that is not safe.
But on the flip side,
but it's not the doctrine of the church.
Interestingly enough, David Bradshaw, probably the leading scholar in the Orthodox English-speaking world on the essence energies question, wrote Aristotle East and West,
right,
arguing for the uniqueness of Paulimite essence energies distinction and the implied metaphysics. He stated in a recent article published just this year that actually, why don't I just read it?
Right.
Now it's a bit disappointing, the article, insofar as it doesn't, in my opinion, adequately and positively present the nature of the essence energies distinction. But in this article, and what's the title of it here? Essence and Energies. What kind of distinction? It's on academia.edu and published in Analogia, St. Gregory of Palamas, Special Series, Part 4, 2019. So he's publishing this article, and he goes through the Thomistic distinction of real distinction, major and minor, rational distinction, major and minor.
This is like, I already see it.
And then he goes into discussion of the Scotistic formal distinction. Now, even notwithstanding, I think, a certain lack of a positive account, he goes through before this the notions of distinction, kat opinion, and the various usages in the Greek fathers. But anyway, he goes on to discuss Scotus. But interestingly, and this is something that has been argued in the scholarly literature that I've been somewhat involved in, is he does recognize towards the end of his paper this distinction.
Scotistic formal distinction.
I would merely raise the issue. This is on page, what page is it? 30, it might be 34 of his article. I merely raise this issue as a way of indicating how fraught with difficulties the traditional scholastic categorization of distinctions actually is. Surely then we should be cautious, fair enough, in applying it to the essence energies distinction, lest in doing so we merely compound one source of obscurity upon another. This is based upon the preceding text.
Right.
Let us not say that some comparisons, this is not to say that some comparisons may not be useful in some cases. I would agree with Spencer, Mark Spencer wrote an article, that the Scotistic formal distinction is the nearest correlative among the scholastics to Palamas' distinction between divine essence and what Palamas calls God's natural energies, such as goodness, being, life, wisdom, and power.
Lol. Sorry.
Bonaventure, Scotus. You know, this now Bradshaw is admitting this now in a published piece that there is a certain corollary between Franciscan's metaphysics of God ad intra and the Paulimite essence energies distinction.
But he does give a little bit of clarification.
He does provide a little bit of clarification. However, it is not to say, then, reading Bradshaw, that is not to say that these simply are the same distinction. Fair enough. But we're not really quite sure what the nature of that distinction is between essence and energies. Right. And we'll give Bradshaw time to speak his own mind.
But he probably won't come up with any other conclusion than the Franciscan
school. Well, you'll read it. For Palamas, it is crucial that the natural energies precisely are energies, energeia, and are thus acts that God performs. There's nothing incompatible with
that's
Franciscan
just,
metaphysics. This is fairly obvious. For this reason, creatures can participate in them. Sure, fine. You've got the similitudes, you've got the pure perfections, you've got finite, infinite modes,
which are the terms of the energeia.
Exactly. For this reason, creatures can participate in them, just as they can, for example, participate in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Polemos operates, yes, true, with a very different conceptual framework than does Scotus, precisely regarding perhaps the language and the articulation of the formal distinction, but not the metaphysical foundations and sources of that distinction. No, the sources are Gregory, Nazianzen, and St. John of Damascus, St. Bonaventure. Going on then, and in drawing comparisons between them, we must not lose sight of these broader differences. Well, these broader differences are fairly unspecified, and they seem to be general gestures towards maintaining a difference and a uniqueness of Polemos. I get that. You want Polemos to have something new and original.
Well, hence we have Franciscans and Thomists and all this kind of stuff.
The best general description of the essence energies distinctions remains that which is implied by the meaning of the word energeia itself. It is the distinction between an agent and the agent's activity. Now,
oh my gosh, well that's Franciscan.
There's nothing. There's no problem even with Aristotelianism on this point. In the case of God, however, we must recognize that his range of energeia is extremely diverse. I just said with the Franciscan school, we can't delimit the number of energies. As I have pointed out elsewhere, some are eternal and others temporal. Well, that's ambiguous in itself.
Meaning some are created.
Some have terms freely ad extra. But
us.
Yes, creation. Others some are contingent, others necessary. He just repeated the same point with different words. Some are best conceived as realities or energies, others as activities or operations.
See, in one sense,
and
that's
yet
more
others
sloppy.
As attributes.
That's just being...
Well, you're moving from the specific back to the general.
Back to the specific.
They're saying because we have this general language that we want to use, there can't be more specificity arrived at. He's already conceded that Scotus
goes more specific.
Is an analog, and he's got to deal with Gregory Gennadius Scholarius, Gorgios Gennadius Scholarius, who uses Scotus and Mairones and Bonaventure to articulate Polemos. Rather than seek to fit this multiform concept into categories that are foreign to it, we ought to seek to understand it in its own terms in light of the sources and concerns that shape Polemos thought. Fine. What are those sources? Some of those sources are the same, especially the most pertinent sources.
But can I speak to that? Can I speak to that? What we're all talking about? What we're all talking about is the same realities, right? So when I talk about let's do this. There's God who acts. There's God who acts from uncreated energy, such as his love. Is God from all eternity loving? Yes. Is God from all eternity creator? No. There's a nice distinction. Does he love his creation?
Well, he is from all eternity creator.
No, but he didn't
But it's
create.
Contingent and it terminates
that's
temporally.
What I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean.
He doesn't create necessarily.
No, he doesn't create necessarily.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and so
I get it.
And so
creation isn't eternal.
Right. And then once creation is there, we have created energies.
That's right.
Because the term is created.
Yes.
Because he's loving a created thing.
We have created energies precisely because we have created forms or essences.
Right. But the love that's a part of that, the love is an uncreated love. Even though its term is through created energies.
Yeah.
And it's talking about activity. And what is different about when God acts toward his creation, and then God acts from himself intentionally, from whatever, person or anything like that, from whatever faculty or whatever we're talking about these, look at how this is an absolute simplicity.
It's not absolute simplicity in the Thomistic construal.
Yeah.
So we can ask then two questions. Well, three. One, is the Franciscan tradition acceptable within the Latin tradition? And that the correlative to that question is Thomism the only system?
No.
The second question is Thomism different from Franciscanism on this point? Seems the obvious answer is clearly yes.
Well, it has a verbiage lack.
Well,
it doesn't have source. It doesn't have the sources.
Yeah, and it doesn't do the same work.
Right.
And then thirdly, is there an objective, at least closer, conformity in terms of common sources,
Right.
common argumentation, common conclusions with respect to these metaphysical dogmatic questions of the Godhead, the Trinity ad intra. Is there a closer conformity between the Franciscan school and the Pauline school?
Well, I mean, I just want.
Yes.
Let's live it. I'm a little bit of a lull freak, you know. Me giving all my mnemonic loving and all this like sick, and I'm not just getting a kick on lull or anything like that. I just find him right now, you know. Okay, maybe it's a kick, but let me in this kick. Some of the explicative power of lull. Did you know that the definitions that he gives to goodness, wisdom, and all these things isn't like the Islamic school? It's definitions in terms of energies.
Absolutely.
His definition isn't about the essence. When he talks about goodness, that is one of these things that they're discovering. Anthony Bonner, in his literature, he's talking about, notice how these aren't genus, species, essential definitions? No, these are energeia definitions. Oh, he doesn't say energeia. Okay, well, Bradshaw, he doesn't say energeia. Oh, but he says they're in form. How do you unite the two? You say definitions of agent. When I say agent, I mean also uncreate and created, because I'm joining the two, right?
With both form or substance and hypostasis, or termination.
And just because Palamas isn't dealing with the unity of those, well, he does when he says God, right? So when I go to the more general thing and I say agent, because that's the scholastic, well, divine agent, and then we have and the terms are either created of his activity. So, you said activity, Latin word. Well, okay, operazione, Latin word. But Bradshaw uses activity.
Operation.
Attributes. These are all scholastic terms. He's actually saying the English words he's using, which are derived from the Latin words, from scholastics. He's saying, he's explaining in English with scholastic terms that are derived from the Latin guys. And then he's saying, well, you know, these distinctions aren't there. Bradshaw, I'm not saying anything like this, but look at the article. You're using English terms etymologically who have their source in Latin scholastics. And then you're saying with those words that the Latin words are deficient. Sorry for the energy. I'm not a doctor, so you can like hate me all day long. I shoe horses, bud. You know? So it's like, you know, come on, shoe my horse, you know? Go ahead, tell me I'm doing it wrong. You can even tell me I'm doing this wrong, but it seems obvious to me. Like I read this article and I see all these scholastic terms in English. Are you serious? I mean, seriously. I mean, write another article explaining why you use attribute, activity, operation. Yep. Because that's Bonaventurian. Operaciones, activitas.
Well, logoi.
Raciones. Yeah, raciones. The reasons, divine reasons. Right? How can you even talk English if you can't talk English if you're Orthodox? And for that, I'm really sad. Because it's fraught with at least the covert, like I was talking about, argument of authority. Because we're laying upon you right now a bunch of semantic history, which you're just using like, hey, I'm going to use these words because they're out here in the English soup. Where did they come from? Sorry.
Well, I think I
got really excited about that.
We could continue.
I wanted to blow that one out of the water too.
We can continue with a couple more documents. Alma Parens from Paul VI. Now, whatever you think of Paul VI, it still is an authoritative magisterial document in the Catholic tradition. And interestingly, he continues the thread, but modifies the thread of scholasticism and theology in general, recapitulating and reorienting the efficacy and validity of the Franciscan school. 2 points that are important about this document is, one, he affirms the validity of scotistic philosophy and theology. He says, now think back to Triumphantis Jerusalem, Bonaventure is a primary doctor of the church. He says Scotus is the perfecter of Bonaventure.
Right.
Now you can do the inference with the middle term.
Right.
If Scotus is the perfecter of Bonaventure, Scotus has a status analogous to Bonaventure.
Right.
And thus, he's a perfectly canonical and valid theologian and philosopher. Finally, and perhaps this is the coup de grace, is that how you say it in France?
Yeah, coup de grace.
Coup de grace.
Coup de grace.
Coup de grace. Of the Thomistic hegemony, or this narrative of Thomistic exclusivity, is simply the fact that Scotus says that Paul VI says that Scotus should be used to combat the clouds of atheism.
Right.
Now, this is a philosophical discussion.
Right.
And then finally, we find in Fides et Ratio by John Paul II, the affirmation and clarification. Again, he cites Bonaventure and Thomas and Rosmini and Vladimir Lasky and Pavel Florensky and Edith Stein and Etienne Gilson in the same context. He says in the same document that the Catholic Church has no exclusive philosophy.
Sorry, Soloviev, you weren't mentioned there.
He was mentioned, actually.
Oh, okay.
I forgot him.
Yeah, I just wanted to put that in there. I like Soloviev.
So you know, if you're dealing with the entirety of the historical thread here, the totalizing, even if you want to say predominance, even if you want to say de facto moral exclusivity of Thomas, it's never been part of magisterial teaching. Moreover, there are just too many Franciscans committed to the Immaculate Mother and the absolute primacy of Christ to make Scotism disappear.
Okay.
And we've already established then the canonical validity of the Franciscan school, the acceptability of it. We then can clarify that any definition or stipulation of divine simplicity has to include the Franciscan school.
Right.
We've also argued for the fact that the Scotistic Franciscan Bonaventurian notion of God's essence and attributes has a de facto common sourcing in the Greek fathers.
Right.
And in fact,
was used by
Gennadius Scalarius and Mark of Ephesus approvingly.
Yeah.
And so to use absolute divine simplicity as a refutation of Catholicism, and to use Thomistic absolute divine simplicity as an ultimate exclusion on the part of the Catholic communion of the essence energies distinction is simply not true, either historically or conceptually.
Okay.
And that's the important point.
This
is the point.
Right. This is the point. Now we answered to the point. Now we'll also answer to the man. We don't know exactly what your history was in the church, but if it was FSPX or this is not representative of even, we'll say, that is a relative recent phenomenon as a piece of resistance to Vatican II, right? All of what we stated is a part of what even they would consider orthodox, or true Catholicism.
Even if they don't avert their attention to these facts.
Right.
Even if they don't, through psychological limitations, accept these facts. It nevertheless is the objective witness of the church.
Right. So this is even pre-Vatican II.
And East.
Right. This is pre-Vatican II. This is even after Vatican II. We're not talking about the smoke of Satan here. We just showed that there's a continuity in all of this, in Orthodox Catholic circles, right? And I mean, whatever you say of later popes, or if you're part of FSPX or Sedevacantism or this kind of stuff, we've already covered that too. And to represent that your position, if you're saying Catholicism is FSPX, or whatever, is there any magisterial authority coming out of that? Well, I mean, insofar as they repeat the tradition of the church and all that kind of stuff, they're Orthodox. They're true. Orthodox, not in the sense of Eastern, but they're authentic, right? Insofar as they follow tradition and they follow doctrine. Now, they might exclusively use Thomas, but the church for centuries has not, even prior to Vatican II and all the kerfuffle. And it's all there. So not only is it an answer to the point, it's also an answer to a man, and it's not an ad hominem. Okay? It's not a fallacy. Because what J. Dyer is claiming is that from his own authentic, what he believes that his experience of the church was authentic. Well, first of all, he wasn't in the church I'm not going to deny he had an authentic chemin or a journey, right, into orthodoxy. But if this is his point for becoming Orthodox, then it's from a Catholic context, which is deficient. And if you say, well, we don't represent that, we represent what was outside of this FSPX or this resistance movement in the church. No. We're talking about things that were back to the Council of Florence. We're showing that Lateran IV was prior to Thomistic development, because it was prior to Thomas being born.
And Vatican I. This is inclusive of the Franciscan tradition.
And his own tradition, if he was a Catholic, FSPX, or one of these groups, they would hold to those councils. They would hold to everything I just said. And if they don't, it's because they just not read into history like this, and they're Thomistic, rigorist in their interpretation what is Catholic doctrine. And they're taking the fact that he's a common doctor, or that it is part of these canons, that he must be taught, and we just put it in its historical context, and we showed that the Franciscans are not just a tolerated bunch of heretics. Okay? So that's an answer. Okay? I don't know. We've had going. Yeah, we got it's like 2.5 hours, 3 hours.
We've got more, but for another time.
We got it, for another time. So why don't we, I don't know, let's say something in common to everyone here, and we pray that, what we say would be well received also, by our brothers. And we don't mean it in any mean-spirited way, but we mean it because we can't just capitulate on on a point where, it just can't. We can't. And if Catholics are not going on Jay Dyer's show, I'm sure Dr. Jared would be better than me. I'm not, but if there's somebody to have a conversation with, and I would say, this is the type of conversation that we can have. We can present a lot of things like this, and maybe this is the forum to do it. And we're free to do it, like Jay Dyer is free to do it. But this is in a dialogue of not false ecumenism. We're not we're just answering to a point, and we're answering to a man. And so God bless us all, and
Amen.
Why don't you lead us in our Father and in a doxology as well.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit,
both now and forever, and unto ages of ages.
Amen.
Most Holy Theotokos, save us.
Save us.
And Christos voskres. Voistinos Christus.
Voistinos voskres.